Well, good morning. Today we start an adventure in a new book. It's a book out of the Old Testament, a book that is probably known by you, a book that's well loved. It's the book of Ruth. It's a very interesting book. It's interesting for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's the only book in our Old Testament canon that's written about a non-Israelite. Ruth is actually a Moabite, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. And so it's interesting for that fact, the only book written about a non-Israelite in the Old Testament. It's also only one of two books in our entire Bible named after a woman. Of course, we get the book of Ruth, a lady. We also get the book of Esther. And what's interesting, a comparison about those two books, Esther is actually an Israelite living among non-Israelites. The book of Ruth is just the opposite of that. Actually, Ruth is a non-Israelite living among the Israelites, so kind of an interesting comparison there. But there's even yet another thing that's really important about the book of Ruth, because we realize Ruth is part of the lineage and ancestry not only of King David, but of Jesus. And so when we study this book, we realize that we're studying David's great-grandmother, but more than that, in the lineage of Jesus himself. Jesus is a descendant of Ruth. It makes it interesting, especially when you consider Ruth is actually only one of four ladies mentioned or at least alluded to in the genealogy of Jesus. Usually you give the males, you don't give the females. And when you start and you take the genealogy of Jesus, there are four ladies listed. And yet as you look at those ladies, it's interesting because not only are they women, but these women have a very storied past. Really a dark picture, if you will. And we can start in the lineage of Jesus, and the first woman mentioned is a lady named Tamar. It's an ugly story. It's a story of a woman who had two husbands, both who died, and in order to have offspring, she actually schemes to have a child by Judah. And it really is an ugly story. And yet we find out that she's in the lineage of Jesus. Or we can go on a little bit farther. When we get to the book of Joshua, we remember the story of Rahab. Now, Rahab's a prostitute. And yet, she's the lady that harbors the two spies from Joshua. And so because of that, she's saved. And so Rahab also makes it into the lineage of Jesus. Rahab becomes Boaz's mother, which is interesting. But so far, we get two ladies with a storied past. It doesn't get much better when we come to Bathsheba. Remember, Bathsheba's the woman that David saw bathing. And he lusts over her, has an adulterous affair. It's Bathsheba they have a child by, and actually Bathsheba's husband Uriah is murdered. And then, of course, we get Ruth herself. Now, a beautiful story, and it seems a very loyal woman, but you need to remember, Ruth is not an Israelite. She's a Moabite. And if you remember that story, the Moabites actually come from the line of Moab. That's why they're called Moabites. But a product of Lot's incestuous relationship with one of his daughters. And so as we look through these people, they're ladies, it's interesting they're mentioned, but they've got a very storied past, and even the book of Ruth comes out of a dark time. And that's just interesting. And I want to tell you that's part of the reason why the book of Ruth is written. It's an interesting book that comes out of a very dark period. And we're going to talk about that. And yet, even with all that darkness, Ruth has been called the greatest short story ever written. And it is a beautiful story. It really is a bright spot in a very dark world. But it comes amidst this dark time. In fact, we're only going to look at the first 7 words of the book of Ruth. We're going to read, in those days when the judges ruled. It gives us the context. And really to understand the book of Ruth, you need to understand that context of when this story takes place. And so today I'm going to give us a little bit of background. We're going to start a journey in the book of Ruth, but I'm going to give you some background to this book. And for some of you, this type of stuff doesn't interest you. It's background. But I want to tell you it's extremely important for us to understand this book. And so if it doesn't interest you, you can just take a nap and I'll wake you up in just a little bit. Not really. But I want to give you some background for the book of Ruth, and I want to try to answer some questions. And they're really those W questions. I want to answer the questions, who wrote it, and when was it written, and why was it written? Because I don't think you can understand the beauty of this book unless you understand that background. And so we're going to try to tackle some of those issues. And the first one, I just want to tackle the issue, who wrote the book of Ruth? And before you answer Ruth, you need to stop and kind of catch yourself, because that's not the right answer. The truth of the matter is, it's more difficult than you might imagine to try to establish who wrote this book. There's nothing in the book itself that helps us identify who the author is. But that's not to say we can't kind of speculate or even maybe come to a good answer. But there's no signature in this book, and so it's not like the person that wrote it wrote their name at the end or tells us as it begun, hey, this is a story of so-and-so. And so we have to do some sleuthing, if you will, to find out who wrote it. Who's the author? Well, we do have some clues. Actually, Jewish tradition in the Talmud, it says that Samuel wrote this book. Not that we can just take that and say there's some things in the Talmud that we say, well, that's not really quite right. But there is good tradition for Samuel, and it makes a lot of sense. And in fact, let me give you a couple of reasons why I think that might be true. Well, first of all, the language of this book is very similar to some other books. It's very similar, in fact, the same vocabulary as the book that precedes it, the book of Judges. It's also very similar to a couple other books. They're called 1st and 2nd Samuel, which does give us a clue about who wrote this book. If it's the same vocabulary, the same style of writing, it might suggest, like the Talmud suggests, that Samuel is the author. And so, again, we're getting some evidence that maybe that's true. Josephus, you've heard of Josephus, actually lumps these two books together. And what's interesting is many of the Hebrew Bibles, actually Judges or Ruth, are bound together in one book, suggesting these stories go together, as the first 7 words of the book of Ruth tell us, but also maybe that the same author wrote these things. And so evidence kind of keeps building up. Also, we stop and realize, who was Samuel? Samuel was a prophet of God, which if we're to get Bible from that, we might expect it's from a prophet. And so all those things adding together, it could be a good guess. It could be a good determination, although we can't be dogmatic about it. But probably, and my guess is, it's Samuel that wrote this book. And so we think, okay, the words of Samuel, but again, we can't be dogmatic. Second question, and I think this one's interesting. When was it written? And as soon as I say that, I've got to stop and clarify something. The story and the events that take place, pretty easy to identify at least the period when that took place. And so the story from the book of Ruth took place at one time, and it was probably written at a different time. And I'm just going to suggest this. I bet the events took place actually before they were written down. That's just my guess. It doesn't have to be that way. Now, there are some books in the Bible that we call prophecy, right? And so events are going to take place after things are written down, but I don't think this book goes into that. And so I'm going to stick my foot out there, climb out on a limb and say, I think probably the events took place before it was written down. Are you with me so far? And so let me try to answer both those questions. When did the events occur? And then come back and say, when were they written down? And I think this is interesting. I hope you do too. But we read the first 7 words. We know it's during the time of the Judges. Now, that means it's between the time of Joshua. Remember, Joshua fought the Battle of Jericho. He goes in, conquers the land. It's after the time of Joshua, but it's before the days of the kings, specifically Saul. And so we've got a time period. We know it's during this time between Joshua and the kings, which puts it about 1350 BC to about 1000 BC. So a period of about 400 years. Specifically, you're saying, well, that doesn't make much sense to me, 1350 BC. Just think of some of these people. Think King Tut. Okay? He would have been ruler in Egypt during the same time in Israel that the Judges were taking place. Or you could even say Ramses II or Ramses III, a 400-year time period about that time. And that kind of helps us, but we might even want to stop and say, can we narrow it down? That's 400 years. When does Ruth specifically take place? And it's interesting because there are a lot of scholars who want to try to determine exactly when it took place. There's much debate. We know from the book of Ruth that there was a famine in Israel. Okay, when did that take place? We know it's a time when there's peace with Moab. And most scholars are going to actually land on an 18-year period during this king named Eglon. He's a Moabite king that comes and rules and oppresses Israel. And it's during that time where Moab and Israel are kind of the same. Maybe Elimelech and Naomi actually go over to Moab because it's the same thing during that time. And after Eglon's killed, we know that peace is restored to the land, and also God blesses Israel. So maybe it's during that time. And if it's true, if it's during that time when Eglon was killed, you can just think Judges chapter 3. And it makes a lot of sense. That would have been about 1294 BC. Some are going to put it later. They're going to put it during periods like maybe Gideon. That'd put it about Judges chapter 7, Judges chapter 8, about 1191. But again, we can't be dogmatic, but sometime during the Judges, and we know that because Ruth says during the time of the Judges. But still, we've got to stay, okay, that's when the events took place. When was it actually written down? And I'm again going to suggest after that sometime. Again, there's much debate. Some people want to put this book late. Others want to put it early. And I'm going to suggest to you the best evidence, in my opinion, is this book was written very early. In fact, the events not only took place early in the period of the Judges, because actually Rahab is Boaz's mother, and so there can't be a whole lot of time that's passed between this story. But I'm going to suggest also that it was written down fairly early too. And let me just give you a couple reasons. First of all, the vocabulary in the book of Ruth is very early Hebrew. There's some things that take place, and as Hebrew develops, some phrases that are adopted that come later that we do not find in the book of Ruth. And so the author of the book of Ruth uses early Hebrew, and so it makes the writing fairly early. We also know that if this book is linked with the book of Judges and the vocabulary is the same, we think the author's the same. The book of Judges talks about Jerusalem as a Jebusite city. Now, Jerusalem's later conquered by David, and when it's conquered by David, it's no longer a Jebusite city, it's an Israeli city. And so it's got to be before that. There's also another city, Gezer, which is an Israelite city with King David, but not in the book of Judges. And so again, I've got to put it back earlier. I'm also going to suggest this. If Samuel is the author, the likelihood is that Samuel wrote this book before he died. That's just my opinion, right? Harder to do after you're dead. And so that, again, puts this book early. There's one other thing that's interesting, that one of the reasons why Ruth is written, because Ruth shows the lineage of David, right? That Ruth is David's great-grandmother. And I'm going to suggest to you that this book is not important until David becomes important. And so it's after David becomes important that the book becomes important to show the lineage of David. Are you with me? And so we've kind of narrowed this down. We know that David has not become king yet because Jerusalem is not an Israeli city and other things haven't taken place, and Samuel has already died by the time David becomes king. And yet David's important enough to say, we need to tell a story about David to show you who it is. And so I'm going to suggest to you that it's after David becomes anointed that he becomes important. And remember, he's anointed king for a long time before Saul actually gives up the throne and David becomes king. But I'm suggesting to you is written between the time when David is anointed, because that's when he becomes important, and before Samuel dies, because it's hard to write after you're dead, and before David becomes king, because cities change their allegiance when David becomes king. And so we can actually narrow this book down and say it's written about 1015 BC. And I think that's important. During the time of Judges, Samuel writes this book down to tell us a story of David's great-grandmother. But not just David's great-grandmother, the lineage of Jesus. And so it becomes important for us to understand this. And so we come to the conclusion kind of when it was written and who wrote it. But I've got to say there's another important thing before we even dive into the text. And I want to tell you why it was written. Why this book? And we've got a glimpse already. First of all, I've got to tell you, it's a great story. In fact, it has been called by many people, even outside of Christian circles, the greatest short story ever written. And for that reason, I'm going to suggest that maybe you take out your Bibles and just read this short story. It's short, it's 4 chapters, a beautiful story. And so it's great. It might have been written down to us just because it's a fabulous story, but I think it's greater than that. Also, we've talked about the fact that it becomes a biographical sketch of the lineage of David. That's important for us. Even more important for us than it was for them, because it becomes the lineage of Jesus, the Messiah, and so we can trace his lineage. And so it's very important for that. But I'm going to suggest there's one more reason, and it comes to us from the very first 7 words in the book of Ruth. Why does the author, Samuel, why does he say this took place during the time of the Judges? The reason is because the time of the Judges was the darkest period in Israel's history. It was a very bleak time. The background of the Judges, you can't understand Ruth without the background of Judges, because it takes place during the darkest period when the dark times, the nation is collapsing. The nation has turned its back on God. The people are corrupt. And yet even during the bleakest time of Israel's history, God is still working out his redemptive plan. God still has a purpose, and God's will is still going forward, even when the nation of Israel is collapsing, and even when everything looks so bleak that nothing good could possibly happen. We get one of the bright spots in history, and it comes actually from outside of Israel. And so I'm suggesting that in order for us to understand the book of Ruth, we've actually got to first understand the book of Judges, a very dark time. And that's why we get these opening words, the verses in the days when the judges ruled, because it sets the scene for us. And the first readers would have understood something maybe we don't understand. And it's going to set up a contrast between Ruth, this very bright spot, and a very ugly period in Israel's history. And so I've got to stop and actually rewind. And if you weren't asleep before, maybe you can even doze off now. More background. But I want to tell you a little bit about the judges. The book of Judges is ugly. It's an ugly story. First of all, when I say judge, you shouldn't think this guy in a robe with a gavel sitting behind a desk and listening to attorneys. That's not the kind of judge we're talking about. Actually, the judge we're talking about here are sword swingers. They were conquering people. They were deliverers. In fact, actually, I hope you're not offended by this, you might even think, you might think Rambo. That's really what's going on here. We get people that come in and they conquer, and they are sword swingers. They're going to go in and there's going to be a path of destruction everywhere they go, but they're going to come in and they're going to deliver God's people. And so when we think judges, that's kind of the word you need to think of. A very dark time in Israel's history, about 400 years, but this is a book of misery. This is a book of darkness. In fact, this is a book of military and moral failure. There are a few books in our Bible that show the depravity of man, the perversity of man, the corruption of man. The book of Judges is a book about infidelity. It's a book about genocide. It's a book about anarchy. It's about people who blatantly turn their back on God and they don't pay attention to him. People turn away from God, and because of that, there is great military failure. I've got to back up even one more book, the book of Joshua, we've already studied. But remember Joshua? Joshua led the people into the promised land, and he went and took over much of the country. And so we see Joshua going, and everywhere Joshua goes, there's success. Well, there's a few setbacks like Ai, but we know the story of Joshua and Jericho, and we know the story of how Joshua goes in and conquers most of the land and even divides it up. But the book of Joshua ends, and the job is not complete. And so we get to the book of Judges. In the book of Judges, God is looking for people to continue the work and take this nation, this area that we call Israel, to take it because God has given it to them. And yet here's what we find. They don't do it. In fact, not only do they not do it, they actually lose ground and they give most of what we call Israel back. And so it's a book about military failure, about people not following through with God's promise. It's a dismal book. It's a failure of people to stand up and say, we're going to take God at his word. And Israel actually, throughout this book, falls to the Canaanites and the Moabites and other people. So it's a book about military failure, but worse than that. And maybe even the reason for military failure is because something else happens in the book of Judges. The book of Judges primarily is about moral failure. It's God's people that turn their back on God. Now, under Joshua, we realize there are times of covenant renewal. Under Joshua, we see God's people moving forward. Under Joshua, we see a faithful people conquering the promised land for the most part. But now only one generation has passed, and the descendants of the very people who conquered the promised land, they turn their back on God. Within one generation, Israel turns their back on God. They abandon God. They abandon the founding principles of their nation. They abandon trust in the one who delivered this land to them. There's political upheaval, and the people not only turn their back on God, they turn to idols. Now just let me say those things one more time. A nation that was founded on godly principles, a nation that was trusting in God for deliverance, a nation that really had that as their very core. They lose sight of those things, and because of that, there's political upheaval, and they start worshiping created things rather than the Creator. Kind of interesting, isn't it? There's a repeated refrain that goes throughout the book of Judges. It's mentioned a couple different ways. You're going to see a phrase a couple times that says, in those days, everyone did as they saw fit. Or a refrain that's even more prevalent in the book of Judges, they did evil in the sight of the Lord. Now it's interesting, take the words Israelites out of there or the word king. And those words could be written today, couldn't they? Everyone did as they saw fit in their own eyes. They did evil in the sight of the Lord. And that becomes this refrain. In fact, what's interesting about the book of Judges, although the book of Judges starts at the tail of Joshua when things were going well, the book of Joshua, there are a bunch of spiritual cycles that take place. And the cycles simply look like this. The people are faithful. They're following God. There's time of peace. And yet they turn their back on God. And as soon as they turn their back on God, they start apostasizing. They start doing things that are evil in the sight of the Lord. And as soon as that happens, they experience defeat from Israel's enemies. They're taken over. There's an invading army that comes and takes them over and really oppress them. And during that oppression, there's all kinds of suffering. And during the suffering, the people finally kind of wake up. And they turn back to God and they begin praying for God for deliverance. And so God, in answer to their prayer, he brings them a deliverer, which restores a time of peace. But here's what's interesting about the book of Judges. At first, we see periods of refreshing and renewal and peace that are 80, 90, 100 years long. But here's what happens. This downward spiral, those cycles intensify, and they shorten in duration. And so the times of peace, they shrink way down, and the times of oppression, they get far worse. And so here's the cycle with Israel. It's going down, down, and down. And God sends military leaders, but the interesting thing about the book of Judges is we see these conquerors, these deliverers, these rescuers, these judges, and man, they're actually pretty immoral people. And yet God still is working out his plan. We see that the deeper we get into the book, the more quickly things deteriorate, the cycles quicken and intensify, and things are pretty dark. In fact, even the heroes, can I say this? Even the heroes are mostly bad because they're not following God closely. Now, there are some fun stories. Book of Judges, if you like graphic tales, it's a great book. In fact, I loved this book as a kid. There's some fun stories. There's one story fairly early on. It's chapter 3. It's probably the very time during which the story of Ruth takes place. But there's this great, big, fat, oppressing king. He's a Moabite. His name is Eglon. Now, when you think Eglon, just think egg-shaped. He is a big, fat dude. And he's oppressing Israel. But there is one man, his name is Ehud. It's important to know that Ehud is left-handed. And he comes and approaches this oppressing king. Now, he's tucked a knife into his left boot because he's left-handed. Most people would be right-handed. If they're going to hide it on the right side of their body. But he's left-handed, so he puts it on his left boot, and it goes kind of unnoticed. And he sneaks in to see the king, big, fat king. And he actually goes and he stabs the king with his dagger. And the handle goes in, and the king's so fat that the Bible says it just kind of, the fat just envelops the blade. And so you can't even see the blade. And I thought when I was a kid, that was just a great story. And it even gets better as you read through there. But Ehud actually delivers Israel from this oppressive Moabite king. And again, many scholars think it's actually when Eglon is killed by Ehud that Israel becomes an Israelite nation again, that God blesses it again. There's time of prosperity and a famine ceases. And maybe it's during the time when Ehud kills Eglon that Ruth and Naomi move back. And so, but it's a great story. And I loved it when I was a kid. You know, the fat oozing over the blade of the knife. And so, sorry, but it was just great. There's another story. There's a story about Deborah and Barak. Now, I've got to stop and say Barak, it's not the same guy you're thinking of. There's also a lady there, her name's Jael, and Cicero. Now, Cicero is an opposing general, and things are taking place around Megiddo. You might think Armageddon, because it's the same place. And Cicero's on the run. Israel's chasing them, and they're going towards a mountain. And he sneaks into a tent. And in that tent, he kind of dozes off for a little bit, takes a nap. And this lady named Jael, she takes a tent peg, and she drives the tent peg through his temple. It's a great story. In fact, I love the next verse. The next verse simply this. So here's the story again. Jael drives a tent peg through Cicero's temple, and the next verse simply says, and he died. I just thought that was great. And so, but understand, it's a graphic time. We get stories of Gideon and the fleece, and him testing God, and God whittling down his army to about 300 men, and he becomes this conquering general. We even get the story, of course, of Samson and the Philistines, and we get stories of Samson and Delilah, and we get a Nazirite vow, and they're fun. We see some pretty wicked things actually happening. We get Samson going off and taking revenge on the Philistines, and we see Samson taking a jawbone of a donkey and killing all kinds of men. And of course, we know the story concludes with Samson in a pagan temple and bringing the temple down by pulling the pillars on top of all the people who are gathered there. But I want you to stop and think about Samson. He is not a moral guy. He's not. And yet he's the best that Israel has at the time. We go through this book, and it's a very dark time in Israel history where even the shining spots, they're immoral. It's a bleak, sad picture. Fun stories, yes, but it's a dark time when people have turned their back on God, and the best God has to use are people that are very immoral and corrupt. We get to into the book of Judges, and the tribe of Benjamin. The tribe of Benjamin has been nearly wiped out. And that's how the book ends. Israel has fallen. It's a very dark, bleak, bitter, ugly time. And the stories are not at all good. That's the book of Judges. And yet right in the middle of that ugliness, when people have forgotten God, when people have turned their back on God, when the nation is corrupt, there's political upheaval. In fact, even the leaders of the country, they're not good. They're not godly people. And even when the tribe of Benjamin is almost completely decimated and wiped out, there is one shining point. There's one story that Samuel includes for us, if it's Samuel. I want to tell you, God's still working out his redemptive plan. And we get one of the most beautiful short stories in the world about how God uses someone to bring about a kinsman redeemer, about how God's going to redeem his people. And guess what? In this case, it's not even an Israelite. It's a Moabite. And we find this story of a young woman, a bright spot, a foreigner living among God's people that's a bright spot in a very dark world. There's one shining example when Israel's in shambles, when you think everything might be lost. In fact, the very last verse of the book of Judges is simply this: everyone did what was right in their own eyes. You might think that all's lost, but actually from outside of Israel comes Ruth. And it's more than a story of Ruth. In fact, she's one of four main characters, but it's more than a story of Ruth. It's actually a story of God working, even when no one would have thought that was the case. It's a story of God working out his redemptive plan. It's a story of God's providence and provision and protection, even in the darkest times of Israel's history. It's a story about not trusting in what you see around you, not trusting in government, but trusting in God and saying, even when times are bleak, God's still working, God's still providing, and we should still trust in God. We find a story of an ordinary woman among ordinary people. We find a story about two women against tremendous odds who make their way by supporting each other, but actually by trusting in God and saying, actually, we're going to trust in God even when everything else seems contrary. And that's the story we get. And what's interesting about the book of Ruth, it's usually just read it's a great story and people read through it kind of quickly. But the truth of the matter is, I'm going to suggest to you that maybe some of you, maybe even most of you, need to find yourself in the story. You see, we get a nation that's very dark and black, a nation that's not trusting in God, and all kinds of problems happening because of that. And yet, in the midst of the darkness, we were introduced to several characters. Let me just mention four. First of all, we get this woman named Naomi. She's lost her husband. She's lost two sons. She's had to move to a foreign land. And Naomi actually means pleasant. But during the midst of the story, things are so bad. Things are so ugly. She's lost her husband. She lost two kids. She actually changes her name. She says, call me Mara, which means bitter. She even encourages her two daughters, hey, you go back and go to your own gods. She encourages her daughters, you leave the real God and you go back to your own gods. It's a dark time, and Naomi, she's bitter, she's upset, she's probably even blaming God for what's happened. Maybe some of you are there. Things are tough. Maybe you're in a state of bitterness, just barely hanging on. Or there's Orpah. Now, I didn't say Oprah. That's different. It's a different spelling, just in case you didn't know. But Orpah, she's a lady that's willing to quit and throw up her hands and go home. Okay, you want me to go back? I'll go back. And she does. She just throws up her hands and quits. And again, maybe there's some of you that's what you've done in your relationship with God. You've just thrown up your hands. You started well. Things were going okay for a while. But really, when things got tough, you just quit. What you need to do is come back. Maybe you can find yourself in the story. And, of course, we find Ruth, a lady who's loyal, who is really characterized by a covenant faithfulness, saying, I'm not going to disappoint you or your God. And I'm going to go where you go, and I'm going to let your God be my God and your people be my people. And we find a lady in a very dark time that's willing to trust and be faithful and go and be loyal to Naomi. And, of course, we get Boaz, who's going to do the right thing. Boaz actually becomes an example of what it is to be a kinsman redeemer, an example of what Christ is going to do for us. And I want to tell you that the story actually, it's great because it really does hit us where we live. It's a story that tells us about, even in dark times, God's still working out his redemptive purposes. Even in dark times, what God is looking for is a few ordinary people to say, God, I'm an ordinary person living among ordinary people, but I want you to use me to be extraordinary. And I want to tell you that's how God works. God uses ordinary people to do extraordinary things. And for a moment, in the darkest times of Israel's history, we get a moment of serenity in a very stormy world. We get a very bright spot in the midst of ugliness. And here's my challenge to you. I want you to go home, first of all, and maybe even with a new understanding of the book of Ruth, when it was written and what was going on. I want you to read the book of Ruth. But more than that, I'm simply asking you this. What would it look like if you started praying, God, help me be a bright spot in a very dark world? What would happen if God took a bunch of ordinary people and used them to do something extraordinary? What if God is calling us forward to being bright spots in a dark world? Would you pray with me? Father, I want to come before you. Father, I'm excited about our new journey, a journey into the book of Ruth. Father, the realization that you could take ordinary people and use them to do extraordinary things. And my prayer is, maybe we can be just that. Ordinary people that you use to do extraordinary things. Help us become lights in the darkness. Let us be bright spots in a dark world. And that's our prayer. And we pray this in the blessed name of our Lord and Savior Jesus. Amen.